recording. Okay. We are going to be recording the session, which we will share the link with you later today. Reminder that the recording is up for about 2 weeks, so please download it. Please make sure you're on mute and your video is off. We encourage you to please put questions in the chat box. We are a smaller group today. I see there's only 11 people on the call, but still put your questions in the chat box and then we will endeavor to answer them in the Q&A session. So thank you for joining us. This is going to be an interesting debate. It's an interesting topic and we look forward to sharing what we put together for you. I think both Melanie and I have had our successes and our challenges with managing volunteers and volunteer programs. So we hope that what we put together will be valuable for you and help you in managing volunteers in your organization. Melanie, over to you.
Yeah, just in case you've forgotten who we are, that's us. Back when I still went out and saw the outside world, I did my first in-person strat session yesterday and spoke for 4 hours through a mask. I would really not recommend it. You know, Calvin and I have been around for quite some time and we've launched Fundraising Talk as a platform for you to share and ask questions and help each other out. So I hope that if you're not already on the platform that you are going to pop us an email or a text afterwards to join. Thank you for being part of our tribe, Calvin.
Yeah, thank you very much, Melanie. Right. So, volunteering. Mel?
Volunteering. So we decided that the best place to start is always at a definition. And we found this one: an activity that involves spending time unpaid doing something that aims to benefit the environment or individuals or groups. So one of the things that we wanted to remind you is that a volunteer is just that. It's a volunteer, is someone who is not remunerated. In South Africa, we have that funny beast, which is a volunteer that receives a stipend. As we know, most volunteers in nonprofits in South Africa are actually job seekers and need some sort of support. And I think we need to find a new word for them, because just between you and I, they are not volunteers. And as we've said, it should be seen as something distinct from contractual activity. So if anyone has an exciting new phrase to define a volunteer who gets cash, please let me know. Calvin?
Yeah, so also remember that we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the challenges of the minute you remunerate somebody and they're no longer a volunteer, it brings a whole new dynamic. We understand that with the current unemployment rates and the challenges in our country, recruiting volunteers does have its challenges, and it is very disheartening when unemployed people want to help, but expect a little bit of money to survive, and it's a very difficult space to manage that relationship. But we're hoping that today will give you some tools that will help you through that. So, when and where should volunteers add value? And when we're putting this together, you know, the challenge is that, as Melanie famously says, you have the mad, the sad, the bad, and then the truly dedicated. So you need to understand why the person wants to volunteer, and make sure that they are best fitted to the organization. And don't be afraid to have that hard conversation and say, I don't really think this is for you. Because as difficult as that is much easier than managing when you have somebody who's unstable, not well, doesn't fit in, their values don't fit with your values, they're not adding value, they're actually burdening you. So it is a hard one, but you've got to make sure that you are clear about when and where volunteers should add value. So don't just take on volunteers because Tant Bessie phones and says, I want to help, or a board member dumps their grandchild on you because they've got to get experience for school projects. Make sure your volunteers are adding value to your organization. Otherwise, be brave enough to say, thanks, but no thanks. Can we direct you to somewhere else that wants them? And back to that famous quote of Melanie's, you have the mad, the sad, the bad, and the truly dedicated. So we're looking for those truly dedicated people. The mad, the sad, and the bad, you don't want, because they actually become more work than what they're worth.
Well, the thing is that it's not even that they become more work, Kelvin. They become a risk.
Yeah.
And they're a risk to your organization's reputation and possibly even to the actual running of the organization. So I think that over time, in years gone by, we've tended to be a lot more relaxed about volunteers. It's like, oh, great, you want to help, come along and paint a wall or whatever. But I think it's time to get strategic and use skilled volunteers to shore up those aspects of your business that are not as strong as you would like.
Yeah.
So what do we need to do with volunteers? Apart from the fact that I'm quite militant about how I think volunteer programs should be run, they still need to be cared for. It needs to be a caring relationship, because if you think of volunteers as donors, as I mentioned before, it puts a slightly different spin on the relationship. Because the flip side of volunteering is you're getting what you pay for. And sometimes that is the case. But other times when you have someone who is skilled, who is experienced, who brings the right tools to the table, they're a donor. They are donating their time. So it's immeasurably valuable to have a strong, committed volunteer. And I sometimes find, and I'm generalizing, I don't want to offend anybody, but I sometimes find I have volunteers in organizations I've worked with who work harder than some of the staff. And they're great to have because they want to be there. They have chosen to be there. So there's a huge power in that. And as we say, imagine if we had a team of passionate, results-driven, energetic repeat volunteers, what we could do. So it's time to get intentional and not have volunteers, but have a volunteer program that has structure, form, and strategy.
Absolutely, Mel. And also remembering, folks, that if you manage a volunteer program correctly and you work well with your volunteers, as Melanie said, they're a donor, their time is valuable, their resources are valuable. But not only that, they're a great marketing tool, because when they go back and talk to their community, their family, their friends, their workplace, their colleagues, their church about the work they're doing for you as a volunteer, they can recruit other volunteers, they can bring other donors on board, they can be an advocate for your cause, they can campaign for you. So don't only see volunteers as somebody to come and clean out the junk storeroom and do the filing.
Paint a wall.
Paint a wall, paint a classroom, plant a tree. And not only on Mandela Day, which is why we also did it this month because of Mandela Month. But please, just as Melanie said, it's a program. It needs to be structured, it needs to be taken seriously, it needs resources. So also that's the important thing, is who is going to be the custodian to take care of volunteers. Some organizations are very strategic where they've got head volunteers or volunteers that have been there forever and a day, and they manage the volunteers underneath them. So just think carefully and unpack volunteers and take a step back and do it because it's the right thing to do, not because you're just expected to do it, or you do it because you can't say no.
Yes. I mean, I worked with an animal rescue charity. In fact, we both did. And they have a paid employee whose job it is to coordinate volunteers, because it's things like feeding babies through the night and those sorts of activities that need to be very structured. So in paying one person, you actually get a team of maybe 10 or 20 people who are supporting the organization's activities.
Absolutely, and we've heard of some programs where some other animal welfare organizations, they've had volunteers to be there for 15 years, every single day, without pay. They're more part of the team than some of the staff. So don't underestimate the value of volunteers. So what is a volunteer program, ladies and gentlemen? It's about being systematic to prepare, recruit, train, supervise, and most importantly in fundraising, thank your volunteers. So you're also making it easy for people to volunteer and get involved. There's nothing more frustrating when somebody says, I want to volunteer. Yeah, okay, we'll get one Pete to phone you back, and 3 weeks later, when Pete still hasn't phoned the person back. Also, embrace technology. Your volunteer program should be on your website. Your sign-up form should be on your website. Testimonies from volunteers that have been successful with you should be on your website. make it as easy as possible for the organization or the individual to come on board. Remember, they are wanting to come and help you. Don't put in huge stumbling blocks. Don't make it frustrating. Don't make it a hindrance. Make it engaging. But as we said in the beginning, make sure that they connect with your organization and they're there for the right reason. So be systematic in planning your volunteer program and recruiting. Just like you recruit staff, you've got to recruit volunteers. And sometimes a volunteer doesn't fit in. And then the training, supervision, and thanking. So a program is a structured program. It's not just a add on to the receptionist's job or to the board member's job. It's got to be a KPI on somebody's JD in the sense of managing volunteers. And there's various different types of volunteers. So also have that structured program. Melanie, the first one's yours.
So what are the 5 steps? As Calvin said, we can't emphasize enough how important it is to plan. You know, a business coach that I attended a seminar recently said, for every hour you spend planning, you save 10 hours in execution. So it's a critical element. You need to be intentional. You need to have a focused approach to how you're going to recruit, sustain, nurture, recognize, and love your donors, because they are still donors.
Thank you, Melanie. And going on to recruitment, as I said, like you recruit for staff, where there's a JD, there is expectations, there's your vision, your mission, your values, the same with volunteers. You need to actively go out and recruit. You need to define what type of volunteers you need for what program. Are they full-time, or they're part-time, or they're ad hoc, or they're doing an event, or they're writing for you? What are they doing? But you've got to recruit them. And be very clear in your recruitment so that you attract the right volunteer. Because if you don't plan and you don't recruit correctly, then you've only got yourself to blame when you have that volunteer that you can't get rid of and that has been destructive and that has caused damage to your organization, or worse, to a beneficiary or your brand. So recruitment, like recruiting donors, like recruiting staff, is a process. It's a system. And get as many people involved in the recruitment as possible, including your current volunteers. Let them help you get their buddies and mates and friends and family involved.
Definitely. Then when we look at orientation and training, treat a volunteer as you would a new staff member. If you have a new staff member induction program, which I hope you all do, adapt that so that it works for the volunteer as well. Because I've often seen really enthusiastic volunteers come into an organization full of excitement, ready to help, and nobody tells them anything. Like, they get as far as, there's the kettle if you'd like to make a cup of tea. And that just doesn't cut it. Your volunteer needs to understand the DNA of your organization, because they are a brand ambassador. And it really is critical that they're orientated, they're inducted into the organization, and that if you are expecting them to particularly work in an office, train them in your systems, so that you don't have some ghastly mistake. I've came into an organization as a volunteer, and I decided in my wisdom to update a database to a new version of MS Access. And I don't know if it's changed, but at the time, if you did that, you basically crashed the system. Whatever version of Access you were using when you started the database was what you had to stay in. And I didn't know that. And I destroyed their entire database. Thank goodness there was a backup. So we were only about sort of 30 records behind. But that's a real example. Nobody said to me, for heaven's sake, don't do that. So it really is critical that you arm your volunteers, you give them all of the tools, including the knowledge.
And just a point here, because somebody might raise the question, I've had the experience where, yeah, but it's a corporate and they're just coming in for one day to help us. You know, we don't need to do orientation and training. Absolutely, of course you do. You just summarize that to an hour briefing, but you still need to brief the volunteer on the work, what you're doing, how you do it, why you do it, how you value them, what their role's going to be today, the do's and don'ts, all that type of stuff. We also have experience with some organizations that deal with very sensitive matters, child protection and stuff like that, where, or animal welfare, where people want to come and play with the babies or hug the children or play with the puppies. And that's not always sustainable because there's a whole lot of regulation and safety issues and health issues and security issues. So also in the orientation training, you want to be very clear with the volunteer. What is their role? What is their mandate? What are they going to be doing? Who are they reporting to? How do they measure their own success? And most importantly, the value they are adding. And as Melanie said, back to the orientation training, it's very important because if a volunteer feels unappreciated, unloved, thrown in the deep end, they're more likely to go, that was a bad experience and it's not good for me. And also remember, ladies and gentlemen, if you mess up your volunteer program, you're messing it up for all of us, because that volunteer is going to go, I'm never going to volunteer again for a charity because it was dreadful. So please understand that it's not just about your organization, but it's the entire civil society that you're impacting when you don't run volunteer programs properly, which goes into the supervision and support. You have to supervise volunteers. If an organization turns around and says, but the volunteer stole something, or the volunteer painted the wall red instead of green, or the volunteer crashed the bus, or the volunteer crashed a database, you are equally to blame because you just left them unsupervised. So you need to make sure you're supervising your volunteer and that they are someone's responsibility. And then very importantly is support. Volunteers are coming to give back. They're coming to donate. They're coming into maybe an unfamiliar environment, into a vulnerable environment. We see it all too often where volunteers want to save the world and buy things for all the children, make promises. Beneficiaries can be very manipulative sometimes. So make sure your volunteers are getting that psychosocial support and debriefing amongst themselves and with somebody in your organization. And just do your check-ins. Make sure that they are leaving on a good note, they've had a good experience, and that they're going to go away as a brand ambassador, even if they never come back and volunteer again. But they're going to go away as a brand ambassador and sing your praises and promote your organization. Just like none of us ever want to lose a donor, you don't want a volunteer to walk away unhappy, disgruntled, feeling like they've not been appreciated.
Absolutely.
Which feeds into the last point.
Yes, recognition. Like a donor, you have to look at a formal, structured way to recognize your volunteers for their service. Whether it's an organization like Animal Rescue, where you have volunteers who work over a number of years and you can almost do a long service awards, or whether it's a short-term donor who has implemented something amazing in their volunteering time with you. It really is critical to recognize them appropriately. I'm hoping that everyone has a recognition matrix as part of their fundraising pack. Something was being ratified by your board that says how you recognize donors. And I would hope that there would be a little section in it that also speaks to how you would recognize volunteers, which actually reminds me of something, Kelvin.
Yes.
Members are volunteers too.
Say that again?
Board members are
Absolutely.
volunteers. And I think it's also important when you look at setting up your volunteer programs, how you can bring your board in as well. Maybe as part of your induction or part of your recognition, your thanking event. It really is important to include your board as well.
And here's a great tip, ladies and gentlemen. Your board can be your crash test dummies. So when you've designed your program, run it through your board as you would a group of volunteers. See how they respond. I mean, I've sat in organizations where the board members have not done an orientation, have not done an induction program, do not know how many beneficiaries there are, do not know what geographical areas they work in, which is scary. So use your board members as those crash test dummies when you're putting your program together. And if you can get them on the program and get constructive feedback from them, that will help you shape and design your program. And they must lead by example. So in other words, if a volunteer is expected to go to orientation, the board better go to orientation. They better understand why they're there. If the volunteer is expected to recruit properly, start with your board. So, but work with your board, work with your committees, because they are volunteers themselves.
Definitely.
Which leads us into the legal aspects, ladies and gentlemen. Don't underestimate the legal, because the minute you accept a volunteer into your organization and you give them the keys to the treasure chest, when things go wrong, you've only got yourself to blame. So take a step back, get your legal in place. There hasn't been a huge amount of case studies in South Africa, but internationally, go and Google. There's plenty of case studies where there's been horrible lawsuits between organizations and volunteers and all sorts of things, because volunteers were let loose. And it's your responsibility, just like your own home. If you leave the front door open and unlocked, when a burglar comes in, don't complain. So if you're going to let a volunteer in, make sure you've got the systems and the processes in place. And that starts with the application forms. I cannot tell you how many organizations I know of where if you phone up and say, I want to volunteer, oh yeah, we'll just phone Sunny or send us an email. There should be an application form. You should know, which tells you a little bit about this person. Who are they? Why are they? What are they? Where are they? Why do they want to volunteer? Especially when you look at international youth that want to come out and volunteer for a couple of months and have a free holiday in Africa. Especially when you're looking at corporates, even corporates. I've had a fight with a major corporate because they go, but we're your partner. We're bringing 50 volunteers and we're helping you. We're not going to fill out 50 application forms. Hell yeah, you are, because I need to know who's going to be on the bus. I need to know who's coming into our space, So it's very important that you fill out or have application forms available for them to fill out. So if they're not prepared to fill out the application form, sorry for you, we can't even talk to you, because then that's already a red flag. There should be a volunteer agreement in place. Even if they're going to be volunteering for 5 hours, you need to have something in place. It's a simple form that brings in your indemnity, brings in your insurances, brings in your liability. It's very clear to them they're not being paid. We've heard horrible cases where people volunteer and at the end of the day go, where's my money? Because there was an expectation. Some organizations, especially if you're working, and the photograph's very appropriate, especially if you're working with vulnerable children, vulnerable communities, women's shelters, family shelters, even animal shelters. If you're working in informal communities or disadvantaged communities, you really should be making sure the people that are engaging with you and your beneficiaries do not have dodgy pasts and stuff in the closet that's going to come out and bite you. It's very, very important. It's frustrating because a police clearance takes a long time to get. But if a volunteer wants to be an ongoing volunteer and work with your beneficiaries, they must put in the sweat. But especially with working with vulnerable children that are placed in protection and places of safety, it's very sensitive. Which leads me into the next into the next one. Please make sure that you have a social media and a photographic policy, because it's very easy for volunteers wanting to take selfies with the children, with the poor little animal, with the gogo in the feeding line, saying, look what I did. And you have to protect the human rights of the beneficiary. You have to protect the human rights of the beneficiary. It's not only a moral issue, it's an ethical issue, because it's bad enough that the poor beneficiary is in that position. Now you've got some person who wants to put it all over social media that they were helping this individual who is in need of help. So make sure there's a social media and photographic policy. Make sure they've seen it. If possible, they've signed it. And not only for the day, but we've seen cases where volunteers who came and did a program and a week later splashed it all over social media because they were not in the country and they were not at the charity. You still have to protect the rights of the beneficiary till eternity. Also your internal stuff, be very careful what photographs volunteers are taking. Someone needs to watch that they're not taking photographs and that they're not putting stuff on social media. So make sure you've got that policy in place and that it is very clear, the parameters, the boundaries. Also your corporate volunteers. We have seen stuff on corporates' websites that is like horrific because the corporate has sent their photographer or their PR team and they're splashing photographs of them all over social media and on their websites with the beneficiary. You need to be very, 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 very careful because at the end of the day, you allowed it to happen. It happened at your project. It happened on your property. It happened in your organization. So you are responsible.
For sure. Which brings us to the indemnity. Please ensure that you have a legal expert look over your indemnity forms, make sure that you have included every eventuality. From an insurance perspective, liability insurance at the very least, if you can find a supplier who will insure your program, all the better, but at the very least, please, strong liability insurance. And of course, health and safety. Elaine pointed out here before we got to the slide that if there's physical work, toolbox talks and health and safety, so important. You know, if you're working with animals, the animal charity that we worked with, they had very sharp beaks and your chances of being nipped in the first 10 minutes were pretty good. And you'll always have that person who will say, well, nobody told me it would bite. Yeah. So make sure that everybody has the necessary equipment. You know, the particular charity that we worked with was Seabirds. And one of the things they made sure was that everybody has Crocs because it's wet, it's slippery, there's water everywhere, there's poop everywhere. You don't want somebody falling on their nut. So it really is critical that if that kind of PPE is required, that you have it available for all volunteers. Volunteers, from that perspective, need to be treated like staff and protected. And make sure that you have an incident management system. It goes into your risk matrix. It's a part of your DNA.
Absolutely, ladies and gentlemen. On the incident management, it's vitally important that no matter how small the incident is, recorded, it's logged, so that there's no comeback and you don't get bitten later on down the line, or you don't get bad PR and media around it. So these are the things you need to put in place before you even start accepting the first volunteer through the door. And if you're already accepting volunteers, best you go back and check and tick the boxes. And if it means that you've got to revisit and re-engage your volunteers to comply, so be it. You know, it's just so important that you make sure that you are reducing your risk and the volunteer's risk, because as Melanie said, if you put a volunteer in a difficult situation and you're putting them at risk, you're really not doing the right thing for them, or your beneficiaries, or your organization. Right. So it's very, very important that you look at you have some rules with your induction. So make sure that your rules are very clear, that your induction program is very clear. Excuse me, the do's and don'ts, what is acceptable and not acceptable. And I always find a lovely way to do it is, oh, excuse me, I'm throwing my throat. A lovely way to do it is storytelling. So give examples where it went wrong or where it was successful. You know, make sure that your volunteers know they can't come on duty drunk. They can't come in on duty inappropriately clothed. They can't, you know, be spending more time taking selfies and videos than doing the work. Make sure that you have the rules, you have the boundaries, and that comes into your induction. But be very clear about your value proposition, your values, and things like your honesty and integrity. And make sure and try and get to understand your volunteer. You know, you can't have the volunteer's values go vehemently against your values, and then it becomes an audience for propaganda or an audience for issues, and specifically around religion, race, creed, all those things, environmental issues, the rights of the child, the UN human rights. You've got to make sure that your donor, being your volunteer, is going to understand your values, your honesty, your integrity, your rules, and your induction. And be okay with that. Once you finish your induction program, you may, and you have to accept that if 5% of the people go, I didn't actually, I'm not, I'm not comfortable. Let them go with love. It's fine. Rather that
Absolutely.
than you sit with the problem. But create that environment where you are very honest to say, now that we've shared with you our values, our principles, and our rules and induction, are you still comfortable? Can you agree to work within these boundaries? And it's okay if you lose 5% or 10%. It's okay. Rather that than you have a problem. And then in the rules, very clear. Strike one, strike two, strike three. What is not acceptable, that immediately they're off the program, and recorded as well. So I've had to have a situation where I had a volunteer that had a substance addiction problem, and we had to ask the volunteer to leave. But we made sure that it was recorded so that there was no comeback of, oh, I was kicked off the program or whatever the situation. Because when the volunteer's got to go home, and in this case it was a youth member, when they've got to go home to mommy and daddy and say, well, I can't go back and volunteer, mommy and daddy wasn't aware there was a problem. So you got to cover your back. So make sure that if you have to let a volunteer go, you're very clear and you're parting amicably, and they understand this is what's in the best interest of the organization and the protection of your beneficiaries, whether that's a project, the environment, animals, children, the elderly, no matter what. You have an ethical responsibility to put your beneficiaries and your organization first. Over to you, Mel.
So where do we get our volunteers from? And the answer is probably just about anywhere. But the logical places would be your individual off the street who maybe has been exposed to your cause in some way or another, corporates, donors. Of course, volunteerism in the corporate sector is being encouraged at the moment because of the benefits to the companies. I'm always a little bit leery of those ones because we used to joke that we had preschools with rooms that were smaller because of the layers of paint on the walls that had slowly reduced the space available. Because the problem with those kinds of volunteers is that they generally just want to paint a wall. They don't want to do something strategic or don't have the time to because they're just coming for a couple of hours. And the trick there is finding the right thing for them to do, whether it's packing food parcels or painting a wall that does actually need painting. There, your strategy comes in. Make sure that you have a couple of tasks in your pocket that can be done by an unskilled group of volunteers who come pitch up unannounced and want to do something. Volunteer agencies. Now, this is quite interesting. That's becoming quite an industry where you have international volunteers who come to spend time in Africa doing their thing. I have mixed feelings about those because you do get the people who are just here to party. But at the same time, I have met some really dedicated individuals who are giving up a time in their life when they could be doing something that's a lot more fun than shoveling penguin poop, for example. And they really want to make a difference. And those are the guys that you grab onto and you hold with both hands because they are special. Service organizations, Rotary, Lions, all of those, great, fantastic people, normally a bit more mature, often professionals. We like those. Schools, universities, also a fantastic place. They make great little fundraisers, money lines and all sorts of things like that, and collecting stuff, blankets, non-perishable food and so on. And then you've got groups and initiatives. And I think that if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that adversity brings out the best in some South Africans. I'm a Rotarian, and one of our guest speakers the other night was a youngster, 23, lives in quite a Lani area, quite close to where I live. And he got his entire street making samis. And they reached a point where they were feeding 3,000 people 5 days a week on a weekly basis. They're not an NPO. They're not anything. It was just, he mobilized the ladies who lunch to make sandwiches. And it was amazing. And so they really have a place, these sort of loose associations of people who come together to solve a problem. And we've seen it in the soup kitchens and all over the place, certainly across Cape Town and I'm sure across South Africa. So those are just some of the places. Sorry. Yeah.
So just to add on, Melanie, the reason why we segmented, and I mean, this can be 20 blocks, it depends on the organization. But you need to have a little teeny-weensy strategy for each one of these blocks, because how you talk to an individual versus a corporate versus a service organization is very different. And also make sure, especially with the world of social media, we've had some horrific situations where individuals are so well-meaning, and they really are well-meaning, but because they didn't engage with the charity first and have a discussion, the effort was futile, absolutely futile. So we need to make sure that when our volunteers engage with us, we understand what they want out of it, and they understand what we need and why we need it. Because as Melanie said, you don't want to paint another wall that was painted last week by a different corporate. So please make sure that you've got an NC1C strategy for each one of these, because, and again, training. The person that answers the phone, that takes calls from the public who say, I want to help, they need to be equipped to say, okay, can I send you information, or go to our website? And even on your website, maybe say, if you're an individual, this is what you can do. If you're a corporate, this is what you can do. Whatever. Because every single one of these is different. They have to be managed differently. They have to be treated differently, and they can do different things for you. So just make sure that you are widening your pool of where you can pull volunteers from. And like fundraising, you've got to constantly have a pipeline of new volunteers coming into your organization, if volunteers is something that you're looking at doing. So constantly having that pipeline filled from various different organizations. Which brings us into this slide. So the crazy new normal. Traditionally, our volunteers would arrive at a location or at a venue or fly halfway across the world and physically come into work. Now with COVID, we've had to think very differently. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to really encourage people to do virtual volunteering, because the perception is, unless I physically go paint the wall, hug the puppy, hug the penguin, hug the child, plant the tree, I haven't volunteered. And that is a misnomer, because there are so many success stories where volunteers have done phenomenal stuff virtually. HR, finance, comms and marketing, being a mentor, typing up documents. I mean, I've heard of organizations where the person who takes the minutes for board meetings is a volunteer. They don't have to pay somebody to do it. And she's dedicated, and she's there every 2 months and does her job phenomenally well. So we've got to move the mindset from physical volunteering to virtual volunteering. Hopefully in time we can go back to physical volunteering. I would encourage that let's learn from this and say, how can we have a balance of the two? So have your physical, but also have your virtual. And look at what people can do virtually that can help your organization. Same rules apply, same parameters apply, same terms and conditions apply. The only difference is they're not physically arriving at your site. The other issue is that when you're engaging and recruiting volunteers, you're now going to have to do that virtually. So, you've got to adjust to how you engage and recruit volunteers on a virtual platform and in a virtual space. So, yeah, it's very, very important that we change our thinking, ladies and gentlemen, and don't just go, well, because we can't physically volunteer, there's no volunteer program. Really, really have a good look and see what you can do virtually. And some people don't want to come into the community, can't come into the community, live too far away, but want to still give back. And they don't or can't give money, they can give time or resources. And if that means, and even your corporates and your individuals, or your retired persons, or your varsity students, if you can get a varsity student to give you 4 hours a week or 2 hours a week, that's valuable stuff. So just think out of the box, think differently, and adjust your strategy to virtual versus physical. And you've got a perfect excuse now with COVID-19, because not many people can go out and volunteer, or it's too risky. And you shouldn't be putting them at that risk, by the way. So how do you convert those people into virtual volunteers while we're in lockdown, or while we're restricted as to how much movement we should be doing? Because the last thing you want is a volunteer bringing in COVID into your organization and infecting your beneficiaries or your staff. Mel, this one's yours.
Yes. So, feedback. That's really important. And if we think of volunteers as a special kind of employee, and we look at what we do when somebody arrives and when they leave, it's really important that you consider maybe a watered down or pared down version of an exit interview, where the volunteer has the opportunity to share what their experience has been like working for you. And it's an incredibly powerful way to improve on your volunteer program, because that feedback allows you to adjust, and often to adjust to mitigate before something turns into a big problem. So I really would strongly recommend that as part of your program, there is a feedback mechanism. You need to be able to feedback to your volunteer. Are you really chuffed with what they're doing? Is there something that you would prefer if they didn't do? Do they need a gentle reprimand for perhaps being a little too open on social media? You have to have mechanisms in place that allow for that two-way conversation, that two-way communication, so that you can make things better, make the experience better for your volunteers.
And Mel, just to add to that, don't wait till the volunteer decides that they've had enough and they're leaving, or they need to leave for whatever reason. Feedback should be regular, just like with your team and with your donors. You know, you don't, if you are only giving your donor a feedback at the end of the grant, you're failing. The same with your volunteers. Give regular feedback. You know, I once knew an organization, and I stole the idea from them. I didn't work for them, but they had a wonderful social movement with their volunteers, where the volunteers would get together every so often and have a social, and the team would come in and use that opportunity to talk informally and get feedback. And it was a really wonderful tool, because you got to almost thank your volunteer by having a bit of a social, and the volunteers organized, the volunteers paid for it, but it was their way of camaraderie with each other, getting to know each other. But also it was a great opportunity for the organization to engage with the volunteer at a different level and get the group's feedback about the organization plus the individual feedback. And also have one-on-ones with your volunteers. You know, it's a phone call or it's a 15-minute discussion, but it's very, very important that feedback is regular and it's built into the DNA, and that in your rules and your induction, you emphasize to the volunteer that you've created this platform and this opportunity. And also, just another quick one, just as, which look, this one, if you don't manage it, could be dangerous, but just as staff can anonymously report things that are concerning them, sometimes your volunteers see things that you do not. And it is very interesting. So create that platform that the volunteer, if they're uncomfortable coming forward, can anonymously put something forward that can be checked on or investigated, or a compliment. Sometimes volunteers have given amazing feedback of team members that the organization were not aware of, how much over and beyond they go in their duties in the community or in the programs. So this is a positive. Use it, but if you don't use it, you're going to get bitten. So make sure that you are really, really strategic with your feedback, and it's built into your DNA and your program.
Yeah, and I would say, just to add on to that, also be prepared to hear stuff that you're not going to like.
Yeah.
I think it's important that we accept that sometimes there will be criticism. Hopefully it's with the goal of improving rather than malicious, but certainly, I've often had people say, "Oh, I can't do that. I can't put a system like that in place." And I say, "Well, why?" And they go, "Oh, well, they're going to tell us stuff we don't like." Well, then put on your big girl panties and deal with it, because that is how you make your program better.
Absolutely. And then, ladies and gentlemen, review. I love this photograph because it is so powerful. If you look at all the individual faces on the wall, they're all different. They come from different walks of life, different cultures, different colors, different religions, different ages. It's important as an organization that you sit back once a year, just as you do strategy, just as you do a fundraising plan, just as you do a budget, that you put time and resources aside to review your volunteer program. And that includes taking a step back and taking a helicopter view of who are the people that helped us this year and why did they help us? What was the feedback we got? What worked? What didn't work? What do we need to change? And I mean, COVID's a prime example where none of us thought 18 months ago that we'd have to adjust like this. But organizations that were heavily dependent on individuals to come and do free mahala work were hit with a brick wall. So it's very, very important that every year, and it's a perfect time when you review strategy and budget and fundraising plans and donor matrices and all those lovely, wonderful things, that you also look at your volunteer program. Take a critical look, be honest, pull out all those tons of feedback forms and whatever, and just take a big wide angle look at your program and try and understand why these individuals came and gave their time and money, what they got out of it, what you got out of it. And I would encourage, if you've got a relationship with volunteers that have been working with the organization for a while that you trust, and even newer volunteers that you are comfortable talking to, bring them into that focus group. But you need to review your volunteer program annually. Are we up to date with legislation? Is our plan aligned with our strategy? Is it aligned with our budget? And this is an interesting one as well. Managing volunteers takes money, ladies and gentlemen. And we were talking last night when we were putting this together. I've yet to see volunteer program as a line item on any NGO's budget. Yet to see. Other than some NGOs that employ a dedicated staff member to manage volunteers. But volunteers do cost money. It costs you money to manage them, recruit them, look after them, thank them. So make sure that you've got it in the budget so that you can effectively and efficiently work with your volunteers. But please do an annual review. And it would be interesting to get feedback from the group to say how annual reviews of your volunteer program have helped you as an organization. Mel.
So, well, this is our last official slide, except there's one more with some news. But we really liked this quote. Do what you can with all you have where you are. And that really is how we need to be thinking. Volunteers are here to stay. We need them. We may not always like them. I have a small allergy about volunteers, but if they're valuable volunteers, they may stay. But we need to treat them properly. We need to treat them as if they were donors, because they are. They're giving us their time. And I hope that we've been able to shed a little bit of light on some tools that you can use to do just that. So I think we should open the floor to questions.
Yep.
So I have a question from Karen. Are third-party fundraisers volunteers?
That's a very interesting question.
Karen, can you come off mute and just give me a little bit of insight what you mean by third party? Do you mean the sort of the mall fundraisers?
Hi, sorry. What we have is we have a lot of like people that have their birthday and they don't want presents.
Okay.
So they basically say they want all their friends and family to donate to us, or they start their own platform on Give and Gain, or
sort of
whatever
peer fundraisers.
Yeah, I mean, are they? I mean, we put them under third-party fundraisers, but yeah, I mean, they should be. Yeah, I mean, that was just the question. Sorry.
Karen, I think that from a global perspective, and I mean, I'm involved with Charity AIDS Foundation as a volunteer myself, but from a global perspective, the minute somebody else is doing something for your organization, so even if they're loading a social media appeal, if they are asking for gifts instead of a birthday gift, if they're doing a dinner to raise money for you, if they're riding in the 94.7 for you, the minute they're, for me, the minute they're associated to your brand and they are talking to somebody else about your work and asking somebody else to support your organization, they're a volunteer. Because the money of, here's my birthday present money, great. But what we don't want is, well-intended Mrs. Jones saying, well, it's my 80th birthday and please give money to, the SPCA, or I'm going to raise money for the SPCA. And then she goes out and does something that the SPCA doesn't need. So an interesting one so here's an example. The Australian fires last year, an individual launched a fundraising campaign on social media. She raised something like $2 or $3 or $4 or $5 million.
As a comedian.
Yes. She promised the world and she gave bank account details, and it was actually her personal bank account. Then when she handed over the money, she wanted the equivalent of a Section 18A certificate for the full value because it came through her bank account. But that money didn't come from her, it came from her mates and the public. And also, it took something like 7 months to transfer the money, and she didn't transfer the interest. Now, that did not go down well with the charity because the public was saying, but we gave our money to this campaign, which is raising money for your charity. So they are volunteers, and that's where that induction and the rules come in, because the minute someone is going out and promoting your organization or doing something on behalf of your organization, if you don't have an agreement in place, if you don't have rules, if you don't have restrictions and put in the boundaries, then when it goes pear-shaped, and it's not that they're malicious. Sometimes people are just well-intended, but they're uneducated and they don't understand your business. So I'll give you another example, is that we were talking about it last week with somebody, where an animal welfare organization was asking for blankets because it's cold. And they got inundated with blankets. But the quality of blanket that was purchased with money raised is not going to last probably 3 weeks with the dogs and the cats, because they're outside, they get wet, the dogs scratch on them, and they bought the cheapest, nastiest blanket, meaning that they were well intended. They delivered this truckload of blankets, fantastic. But if they delivered 30% less volume, but 30% higher quality, the blankets would have lasted for 6 months or a year. So that's where it's about educating your volunteer and just breathing before they rush out. And we saw this with COVID. Everybody rushed out. And instead of breathing and checking, don't make mistakes. So I would say, yes, they are volunteers.
Okay, thank you.
Definitely. And something else I would say, Karen, if you don't already have it on your website, have a look at Macmillan Cancer in the UK and a couple of other, particularly the cancer charities. They're very good at putting together packs, toolkits of, if you want to raise funds for us, here's how you can do it. And I think that that's really valuable because it gives a framework for people to work within.
Okay.
And I know Macmillan had a great one at one point, and I would say most of, if you even look, I think at Kappa for Cancer locally, they have things you can do, host a dinner party, have a tea, and certainly the UK-based ones actually have downloads. So you can download an invite template. You can download seating arrangements, all sorts of things that really add value to the volunteer. So that might be something to look at as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, guys. This was awesome.
Good.
Any other questions, Melanie? Because I've been checking the chat.
Rian did just point out that we have got quite a lot of corporate volunteer programs that we can tap into. And I'm certainly seeing that thanks to things like Beyond Painting Classrooms and CAFSA, we are seeing a much more strategic approach even from corporates in terms of how they manage their volunteer program.
So in 1 minute, I'm going to throw Jill under the bus because I just see now that she is on the call. Jill, can I throw you under the bus and ask you to talk for a minute about the the program that corporates that CAPSA is doing, because you've got a lot of value to add on that one.
Yes, with pleasure, Kelvin, and a very good morning, colleagues, and thank you for this most helpful discussion. It's really, really been interesting, and thank you so much to the two of you for putting it together. I think that you're absolutely right. I think volunteering is becoming and must become much more strategic, much more skills-based in order to really leverage the great value that the different parties bring to the table. So, Kelvin, thank you for mentioning CAPSA, and in particular, the Beyond Painting Classrooms initiative, now rebranded as Inspiring Employee Volunteering. This is an initiative that really focuses on bringing all the sectors together in a collaborative space to really try and avoid the mistakes that you've spoken about, you know, the mismatching of needs, and the corporate really is hopeful that they're making a difference, but the poor nonprofit has got to employ a painter to fix the walls. I think it's really very important that we get much more strategic in our approach, because, as you carefully said, volunteering is really a currency, particularly now in the age of COVID-19. So I think it's becoming a strong currency to be reckoned with. So thank you again for the opportunity just to participate and listen, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joel. So just people that don't know, Joel Bates is the CEO of Charity AIDS Foundation Southern Africa, but also sits on the Global Alliance and works with the Charity AIDS Foundations in several other countries around the world. So it gets a really nice global perspective. But just on that one last point, ladies and gentlemen, is that the cross-selling or the cross-pollination. Remember that if you successfully run a volunteer program with an individual and they go away happy, it's like when you have a good meal, they're going to tell everybody about it. So they could influence their employer, their spouse can influence their employer, their child can influence their school, the family might then come together and help, and vice versa. If a corporate comes and has a fantastic volunteer program with you, we do see that individuals say, well, how can myself and my family and my church come back and help in a different angle? So every person that comes through your gates or through your portal now, because they can't physically arrive, as a volunteer is a donor. And just like we work blood, sweat and tears night and day to keep our donors on board and retain our donors and grow our donors, the same with volunteers. If you give your volunteer a fantastic experience, they're a future donor, whether it's time or money, they're a brand ambassador, and they're a great marketing and PR tool for you and your organization when they go away. But don't underestimate the hard work. That's the takeaway today. It takes money, time, and resources to manage and put volunteer programs together, but the return on investment is great if it's managed properly.
Definitely.
So
we're running out of time.
As always. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, those are our two save the dates. Next week we've got a guest speaker talking about strategy, and then the following week we're going to be talking about packaging the perfect proposal, in the sense of how you package your proposals that talk to your donors, the various donors in the sector. We tried to advertise and give people a heads up 2 weeks in advance so you can plan. I can tell you that the following 3 weeks after that, there's some great stuff under the blankets, but it's going to come out, and we've got some phenomenal speakers coming on in the next couple of weeks as well. So again, thank you for joining us. If you're not on the WhatsApp group, please join. We encourage you to invite your colleagues, even if they're not in the fundraising department, to come online and join these webinars. The webinar will be uploaded and put on the WhatsApp group in a couple of hours. And thank you from me, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Mel, final words from you?
Just as always to say thank you so much. I know how busy it's getting, and we really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us. And don't forget, if you're not part of the tribe, please get in touch with one of us and join our WhatsApp group. Thank you.
Cheers, everyone. Bye. Stay warm, stay safe.